Introducing the moderator today. The moderator is Dr. Dhanlakshmi. She is the colleague of mine in the department. Formerly, she was the Dean of Research and the Director of Community College. Now, she is presently the Controller of Examinations of our college. It's my great pleasure and honor to invite her to moderate this session. Now, over to Dr. Dhanlakshmi.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, all. It's my great pleasure to moderate this afternoon session in this 7-day workshop. And today we have Dr.Sushma.V.Murthy with us to speak about a very interesting topic, feminism. And first, let me introduce her to you all. Dr. Sushma.V.Murthy is an associate professor in Department of English from Christ, deemed to be the university. And she has the teaching experience with gender studies, post-colonial literature, world literatures, cultural studies, and British literature. And she was affiliated to University of Montreal under the Shastri Doctoral Research Fellowship in 2007 and 2008, and secured a doctoral degree in 2014 for her dissertation, The Burnished Phoenix, Lesbian Aesthetics in the Works of Nicolai Bressard, from the University of Mysore. Her research interests include queer theory and literature, feminist translation studies, psychoanalytical feminism, and trauma narratives by women. To her credit, she has the publications of research articles on feminist translations, transgender aesthetics, and queer theory. Currently, Dr. Murthy is in the verge of completing a major research project on the select popular fiction of Triveni, a prominent psychoanalytical feminist writer in Canada. The project examines psychocultural aesthetics, aspects of women's mental health disorders, with a heightened focus on the gendered narrativization of trauma in cases of hysteria. And today we know that feminism is again a very interesting topic, and at the same time it is a controversial topic too. And because though we all know that the basic of feminism, the basic concept of feminism is equality of sexes, many believe that it is against men and dominating men. So we have come across a lot of types of feminisms, like liberal feminism, radical feminism, and many more, and waves of feminine movements. And now we have Dr. Sushma.V.Murthy to enlighten us with the new feminist theories. Ma'am, you can proceed.
Thank you, ma'am, for that very generous introduction, and I hope I live up to the introduction you have given me. Without much ado, I would like to thank the organizers and then begin my session. I will start sharing my slides. Okay. So the whole idea behind talking to you today about feminism is not so much to talk about feminism, but to talk about how feminism has changed, how it has gained momentum, and how it has gained new dimensions, which we normally do not acknowledge, at least in the academic circles. And my idea to talk to you today is basically to give it a polyvalence, give it a heterogeneity, give it an inclusiveness, which feminism somehow has incorporated in its wake, but has failed to address, especially in terms of research and pedagogy and the teaching of gender studies in classrooms. Okay, and that's the reason why I have titled my presentation "Shifting Centers, Spiraling Margins," because it is not just the centers which are in question, but even the margins are spiraling out. They are constantly shifting. And the scope of feminism is not just increasing, but also changing manifold. The nature of feminism has changed. And the identity politics that we bring to feminism has changed in multiple ways. And that is the reason why I chose to talk about new feminisms, not necessarily in terms of new movements of feminism, but in terms of the ideology of feminism itself and how it has changed over a period of time. A lot of the discussions I have in mind are, the result of the research that I have carried out in feminism and gender for the past 20 years or so, as a result of some of my publications, my own PhD theses, and a lot of gender studies that I teach in Christ University. I think for the past, if I'm not wrong, 11 to 12 years, I have been teaching gender studies in Christ University. And I must say, I have learned a lot from my students, from my research scholars, from my colleagues. So wherever possible, whenever I discuss a new idea, I will try to acknowledge that. I will try to bring in my scholars and my students there. And a great deal of my understanding of feminism comes from my own politics of feminism in terms of being a feminist research scholar, working closely with gender studies, but leading a very different kind of life, say in the confines of my family or in the confines of my relationships, whether it is being a sister or a daughter, or being part of a family, being the granddaughter of a certain family. Okay, so I always find this very challenging, the tension that we have between the private space and the so-called political space that we bring to the classroom, that we discuss so extensively in theory. And we are so confident when we talk about feminism theoretically. When we take it to class, we discuss such bold themes. But where one's own reality is not so simple. It's not as simple. So I always see that there is a disjunct between the feminist theory that we teach in class and the realities which women face. And that is the reason why I want to look at feminism through different lenses. And I have tried as much as possible to look at feminism through the lenses of realism, the lenses of oppression that women face in their everyday lives, the heterogeneity of women that we have, okay? And when I say that, I'm not talking about women, I'm talking about trans women, I'm talking about men who are kept out of the purview of feminism for various different reasons, okay? So, and that is the reason why I chose to talk about identity politics. So moving on, this is the roadmap I have for us. So what are we going to look at this afternoon, all of us? Let's begin with the familiar. Let's begin with what made us think of gender, what made us historically look at gender, give it a hard look, and that was feminism, right? So a brief overview of what feminism has been doing for so long, what our understanding of feminism has been for all this while. And then, of course, what are the shifts that feminism has taken? And how do we, therefore, go out from feminism as women's studies to a more inclusive understanding of feminism as gender studies? That is the whole point of this presentation. So as you can see, I'm going to touch base a little, go back to the source, so to say, from where it all began, at least politically, which is feminism. Let us look at a few important milestones that we have covered in feminism and gender politics. And then there is this sudden shift that we call as the identity shift that happened during the 1980s, sometime after the second wave, right? And that is when we started talking about identity and identity politics. And what are the, what therefore are the changes that have happened? Did we have to move away from feminism? Was it a fork in the road, or was it a bend that we all took together? That is what we are going to look at. And the next section, I have named it as WAPs and WETs: intersectionality, dialogic consciousness, and inclusive feminism. So three different theoretical approaches that are popularly taken towards an understanding of feminism and feminist movements today. And finally, how do we ride on this spiral? How do we, therefore redefine feminism, right? How do we look at feminism in terms of the new movements that have gathered momentum in gender studies, namely masculinities and queer identity? So let me just stop sharing now for a minute, and I will come back to the chat box. I would like to ask you, what is your understanding of feminism? Okay, as academicians, as researchers, as people who have been working with gender at some point of time, what is your understanding of feminism? Can I have a few responses in the chat box, please?
Ma'am, few minutes. It is disabled. Just
yes.
Just a minute.
Yes, sir. It is done. It is given.
Yes.
Chat box is open.
Okay.
Ma'am, can you repeat the question, please?
Yes. So I would like you to tell me what is your understanding of feminism. It need not be a very academic response. It can be a very commonsensical understanding. Why do we talk about feminism? What is our popular understanding of feminism? Many of us are teachers and research scholars, and when we take feminism academically to class or to research, how do we understand feminism? Can I have a few responses?
They are responding.
Yeah. So feminism is an awareness and a practice of equality, equal rights. Many of you are saying equal rights and opportunities. Okay, being yourself without fear, that's wonderful. Okay. Standing up and claiming equality for all genders, very good. Thank you, Poonam, for that response. Right to live with respect. So many of you are addressing women. Okay. You're looking at equality in terms of the lack of biases. Okay. So the fact that women have the same emotions and feelings, perhaps as men, to you is what makes you feminist. Okay. Male and female are not same, but should be equal. Okay. Yes. Yeah. So I will stop. We can stop responding here because pretty much all of us are on the same page. Okay. Right. So our primary understanding of feminism comes from a framework of equality, right? So we are not denying that framework. We are saying that that is where it all began. That is where it became political. So when you look at the first wave feminists and their fight for voting rights, and when you look at the 20th century civil rights movements that looked at, racism, that looked at sexism, that looked at equal opportunities and wages for women. Okay, the suffragist movement, of course, which gave voting rights to women across the world. Right. So to a large extent, our understanding of feminism comes from a position of equality and equity. Okay, and this is also very similar to the kind of exposure that I had as a student of gender studies. Okay. So I would like to begin with the same question that the moderator, Dhanalakshmi ma'am, was asking you all. This was a question that one of my friends asked me, and I really didn't know how to answer this when I was in university. She said, aren't we leaving the men behind? Okay. But then, of course, I remember that question disturbed me, and for a few minutes, I did not know what to say. But then, of course, I could stand up as a woman and say, women have been oppressed for a long time, and we live in a patriarchy, and women have to speak up for themselves, and they have to fight for their rights. Sometimes women don't have the most basic civil rights in society, so feminism is important, and therefore we are not leaving the men behind. Okay, but I think her question came from a very deeper sense of unease, from a deeper sense of not addressing all genders. Of course, we begin with both genders when we say male and female, but today, we look at more genders, more than male and female, we have multiple genders. Okay, so how much of the feminism that we have learned from the West, let's admit it, most of our feminist theory, most of our engagement with feminism as a movement, most of our engagement with feminism historically comes from a Western perspective. So you might have read of women writers or women activists or women's movements, but most of the time you will read these either in the post-colonial studies paper, or you will do this as literature, or you will do this as subaltern studies, especially Dalit studies. You might study Dalit women's writing in Indian literatures. I do not really know how much of gender studies or how much of women's studies in Indian universities actually move away from the Western framework that we have for equality and equity. And that is the reason why we talk about equality, equity, and empowerment, the three E's of feminism. Okay. So when you're looking at the whole, idea of oppression or of women's experiences as women, okay, in very real terms, these are embedded in an institutional space. These are embedded in a social context. And they are definitely part of a larger history of violence or oppression, okay? And both genders are part of this oppression. Both genders are part of this framework that we call very easily as patriarchy. And somewhere down the line, our students end up thinking that patriarchy is, basically the men in society who oppress women. But what we don't, really reinforce is that patriarchy is an ideology, basically, right? So the whole attempt of this presentation, going back to the presentation, is to kind of rethink our whole notion of feminism. So if feminism was a movement that began to, end oppression against women or to give equal rights to women, right? It was basically directed at two things. One is sexual difference, which is the basis for the categorization of men and women, and gender differentiation, which happens in very sociological ways, which happens in very concrete ways, which happens in very contextual ways. Okay, if feminism began as this kind of a movement, then when did feminism become a bad word? When did feminism become something that nobody wants to own or possess or label oneself as, right? So what is the reaction that you get when you say I'm a feminist? Immediately, you get a very volatile reaction, or you say, oh my God, your eyebrows are raised, and people want to know, oh my God, she's a feminist, or you're supposed to be a very radical person if you're a feminist, right? So where do we get this understanding of feminism from? That feminists are people who go out with slogans and placards and shout out slogans on the streets, or fight for their rights. This is one aspect of feminism, which is part of the movements that we are all familiar with, right? But what is feminism basically? Feminism is a fight for equal rights, like you all said. And when we say equal rights, it is important for us to look equally at both the genders, if not more genders, as we are looking at today. Okay, so the whole point that I'm trying to make here is that feminism is a movement historically, but that is one aspect of feminism. That is one aspect of feminism that we have been largely introduced to through the 3 waves of feminism, or the 4th wave, or we talk about in the 5th wave of feminism, right? So, what are these waves? Did they rise and fall? Was there some activity which you were measuring as feminists, and after the activity or revolution got over, was there a lull? Was there a brief lull? And was there a wave rising again? So where did this notion of the waves come from, right? So I beg to slightly differ, because the people who have introduced me to feminism, or the people who talk about feminism, or my own experience of feminism, is something that comes from a space of awareness. So if you ask me, ma'am, what are your feminist interests? I wouldn't be able to name one movement which I was part of. I mean, even in my own life, I really do not know how much I have actually worked for the emancipation of women or empowerment of women, right? But that does not make me less of a feminist, right? So speaking very briefly about 2 very important people who made me conscious of the fact that I was a woman and I was treated differently because I was a woman, was, right, my own family to begin with. And then, of course, my research guide, right? And my grandfather, who made it possible for all his daughters, 5 of them in the 1960s, to get a postgraduate degree. He was somebody who insisted that they should, stand on their own 2 feet, right? And get a job for themselves, get an education for themselves. And he had no need to do this. He was he was not so economically well off as to kind of place all his daughters. But one thing that he really insisted was education for his daughters. And thanks to the fact that I'm my mother's child, I'm able to, talk to you about feminism. And I owe it to my grandfather and my grandmother, right? So who are the people who have been to me, to a large extent, role models of gender equality? My grandparents, my parents, sometimes my friends, or even my own father, right? Who did not think twice about pitching in and helping my mom with domestic activities, who would do all the feminine things that men normally did not do. And he was very comfortable in the kitchen. He was a very excellent cook. Sometimes he was reprimanded for that. Sometimes he was laughed at for that by a lot of his siblings and his relatives and friends, right? But he is one example I have from home, right, who has taught me that feminism is an awareness. You don't have to be a woman to be a feminist. And feminism need not be a movement only about women, right? So if you are aware of this very complex structure, right, which requires you to behave differently because you are a man or you are a woman, to me, that is feminism, right? And that is the point where I would like to begin, right, discussing feminism with you. Feminism as a consciousness that can be collective or it can be individual. It is an awareness which can make you sensitive to other forms of oppression. So if you are a feminist, whether you are male or female, you will be sensitive to the needs of people who are oppressed or treated differently. So you cannot be feminist and not be sensitive towards, say, racism or casteism, right? Or animal rights for that matter, right? So if you're a feminist, you are basically somebody who is sensitive about the inequalities. And those inequalities can come from class, they can come from caste, they can come from various aspects. And that is how I see feminism in India. Feminism in India did not come from a radical feminist politics, or they did not come from writers who talked about feminism as a radical movement, right? Or it did not come from individuals who literally broke the conventions and stepped out of society or stepped out of the marriage or family or any of the institutions. In fact, feminism came from a space of socio-cultural understanding. It came from a space of the hegemonies around us. Okay, so who are the writers in India whom we look up to as feminist writers? Right? These are not people who were politically active, or they were not always people who made changes in policies or created feminist revolutions or took out placards and stood out there. Right? These were women who talked about women's experiences from a larger socio-cultural framework, from the hegemony that they were part of. Right? And like Nadine Gordimer, who writes from South Africa, I'm always reminded of her because she's a white woman, right? Writing about the apartheid, writing about colored people, writing about the tribes in Africa on the other side of the border, right? And she is none of these things. And Nadine Gordimer is somebody whom we look up to as a very important post-colonial writer, as an important South African writer, right? But if you actually look at her background, she is white. She belongs to the privileged class. But that did not stop her from writing about racism. That did not stop her from writing about the apartheid. That did not stop her from questioning the whole aspect of nation and nationalism that was, enforced on all the, ethnic tribes in Africa. Right, so a lot of her, writing even goes beyond the purview of South Africa and apartheid and the racism in South Africa to talk about the whole post-colonial construction of a white nation, which most of Africa had to undergo and still continues to undergo in various ways. Right, so is Nadine Gordimer therefore a feminist writer? To me, yes, she is. She may not have talked only about women. She may not have talked only about feminism from a very theoretical point of view. But she did talk about inequalities. She did talk about people who suffered under certain larger hegemonies of, nation and nationalism, or race, or ethnic, minorities suffering under the dictatorship of cultural hegemonies. Okay.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Your slides are not shared.
Yes, sir. I'm just about to share them. I had stopped sharing them because I wanted to finish this point.
Okay, please go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, so going back to the slides, yes. So this is how we normally understand feminism, right? So each time a woman stands up for herself without knowing it, possibly without claiming it, she stands up for all women, is what Maya Angelou says. I would say, right, women don't just stand up for women, they stand up for humanity. And that is an inclusive feminism, right? So let's look at the next slide. Just give me a minute.
Ma'am, you can share the screen. You need to press the down arrow.
Yes, sir. Yes. So this is how I would like to, probably make you look at feminism or bring your attention to these kinds of feminism, right? Feminism as, as a point of awareness, of consciousness, of gender equality, of inclusivity. And if you have noticed, I have highlighted gender here, right? So when we say gender equality, we are not just talking about the equality of women along with men, right? So if you want an equal society, you will have to look at men. You will have to look at other genders, right? So-called other genders, as we call them, right? So are we sensitive towards women's specific forms of oppression? This is very important, okay? So it's very interesting to see how for the longest time we have looked at the hijab or the burqa, the niqab, or any form of veiling among Muslim women as a form of oppression. So where does this come from? It comes from a white feminist, mainstream feminist space, which looks at the veil as a symbol of oppression. Okay, but if you talk to women in Islamic countries, if you talk to Muslim women across the world, the veil means not just a piece of clothing for them. It may not even mean a symbol of gender to them. It might mean a symbol of their religion. It might be a part of who they are, their identity. So they might say, I am very comfortable wearing the veil and I don't see that as a form of oppression. So especially after the 9/11 attacks, with the kind of Islamophobia we have around the world, right? Women who wear the hijab have come under attack in many Western countries, to the point that in many schools and educational institutions and in public spaces, women were asked not to wear the veil, right? Because the beard or the turban or the veil was seen as a sign of or a symbol of communism. And that was the extent of Islamophobia that was practiced, okay? So this idea that the veil or a symbol from one's own culture is oppressive, right? And, it needs to be removed. Or if you look at the portrayal of Afghani women, especially during the Taliban, by, journalists who went from US and Canada, you look at the, there is a different form of oppression there. It is what we call as heterodoxy, right? Where you require women to be modern, or you require women to follow the Western notion of what is modern, to be, emancipated or to be empowered. So I'm sure you have read this very beautiful, theoretical essay by Chandra Talpade Mohanty, which talks about being under the Western gaze and how the West constructs third world women as a single category. So the terms third world woman and third world women are like, they are monolithically constructed. So when they talk about the third world, they put all third world women under one category and they say all third world women are oppressed, or all third world women are oppressed because of these many reasons, okay? But we all know that when women are oppressed, they are oppressed in very, very specific spaces with very specific forms of oppression, okay? So my understanding of oppression might be very different from another woman's understanding of oppression, okay? So it's important for us, therefore, to realize that feminism is, not a collective movement, but a consciousness or awareness of the specific forms of oppression that women undergo. And when you look at a woman or her experience of oppression, it's important to understand that in the cultural context to which she belongs, okay? And the last and most important thing is a non-binary approach to gender. So if feminism is going to uphold the same binary of male versus female or masculine versus feminine, then feminism will lose its meaning because it is going to contradict itself. So if feminism is going to look at gender equality, but at the same time uphold these binaries, right? If feminism is going to be a fight against misogyny, or it is going to be a fight against men who hate women, okay, then that is a very reductive, narrow form of, feminism. So because if I'm going to look at the men who hate me or the men who oppress me, or I'm going to look at people who, perpetuate crimes against women, I will have to look at the system. I will have to look at the structure. I will have to look at the ideologies which require men to be aggressive. It's important for me to look at the ideology, right? It's not enough if I just look at the people, right? Or, create a binary and say all men are violent or all men are aggressive, right? And all men are patriarchal and patriarchy is equal to men, okay? So a feminist, according to Gloria Steinem, is anyone who recognizes the equality and full humanity of women and men. I would prefer to look at feminism through this definition, definitely, okay? So let me look at a few milestones that feminism has already achieved. Of course, beginning with the first wave, suffragist movements, voting rights, right to property, right to, divorce, for example, a very basic right that was denied to women, okay? And policy changes that, came about in the wake of the first wave feminism. And then, of course, the second wave feminists who looked more at sex than they looked at gender, right? So the second wave feminists who looked at writing the body, or looking at women, as women who could talk freely about the body, right? And whose bodies were not merely objectified. Okay, so we have had movements like Eco-Feminism. We have had, the great movement that was initiated by Donna Haraway, which is the cyborg, right? Which looks at the whole intersection of, technology and machines and the gadgets that all of us use, and us human beings, right? So there is the cyborg manifesto for all of us to look at. There is that new wave or fourth wave of feminism that is coming out of the idea of technology. And of course, the more and more globalized we get, the more and more we look at trans-historical feminisms. And what do we mean by trans-historical feminisms? We look at feminisms across the globe. We look at diasporic women. We look at writers who write from a diasporic space. So you're going to look at Jhumpa Lahiri, okay, for example. You are looking at a trans-historical model that we take to feminism, okay? So this is again another definition which I would like to reiterate. If you say I'm for equal pay, that's a reform. But if you say I'm a feminist, that's a transformation of societies. And if you're looking at a transformation of society, then you will have to look at feminism as a movement beyond just the equality of women with men. Okay, so I would like to give you a few concepts here, or a few important frameworks for you to consider in terms of the important shifts that we have made from subjectivity to identity. So when did we start talking about identity? When did identity become so central to discourses around the world? So whether we talk about caste, or whether we talk about class or race, whether we talk about post-colonial concerns such as nation, nationalism, we are basically all of us talking about identity, if you have noticed. So pretty much all of theory today looks at the concept of identity. So what do we mean by identity? And is identity different from the self? Is your identity different from what we call as yourself or subject, or what philosophers discussed as personhood or persistence? Let me just very, very briefly talk about identity here, right? So the idea that the term identity itself, right, goes back to a process of identification, right? So my identity is, right, constantly framed or formed by the interactions I have with different aspects of society, or different categories of society, or different processes, right, of society, right? Which means that identities are relational. Okay, so when I say I'm a woman, what is the reason why I'm calling myself a woman? I'm identifying myself with a woman's body. I'm identifying myself with the roles that women popularly play in society, probably, or I'm identifying myself as not that kind of woman, or as a different kind of woman. But whatever it is that I'm doing, I'm identifying as, or I'm identifying with, right? So identities are relative and relational, which means that there is a dialectic, and a dialectic always involves something that is different, right? So when did I start becoming a girl? The day I was born, right? The doctor decided that I would be called a girl, looking at my biological structure, looking at the sex into which I was supposedly born, right? He said, okay, this is not a boy. I do not see a boy's body here. I see a girl's body, right? I see a female body. Therefore, this is a girl, okay? So in relationship to the biology that was assigned to me at birth, right, I became a girl. Okay, and as I grew up, I was constantly told, okay, do not say climb up trees, or do not, laugh so loud like a man, or, close your mouth and giggle, or, sit in a particular way, or talk in a certain way, walk in a certain way, or dress up in a particular way. So these are the ways in which I became a woman. I mean, that is how I became identified as a girl. And as long as I identify myself as a woman, right, I have to continuously acknowledge the fact that I am not a man, or I have to identify myself as not a man in order to be a woman. So for my identity as a woman, I'm completely dependent upon the identity of a man. It's the same thing for men, right? So look at the number of dialogues you have in films, and especially Bollywood films, right? Which require you, I mean, they say, okay, if you are a man, you will come out and fight with me, right? Or have you worn bangles that you're not going to fight with me, right? So that is how the villain provokes the hero, if you remember, right? I'm sure you have enough of that in, Tamil cinema and other regional cinema, right? And it's very interesting to see how you become a man by not doing the things that are feminine, right? So that is what we actually mean when we say that, we are talking about women, or we are talking about feminine identity or identities, or when we say female sex, we are talking basically about a process of identification. And identities are always relational, which means that I might be the self or the subject or whatever philosophical category that I want to choose to be. But I cannot be any of these things unless and until I identify with, right, those other, selves that I am not, or those other selves which reinforce my own identity in relationship with them. Okay, and that is the reason why we look at these frameworks. One is the Phenomenological Framework, which is one of the oldest frameworks for looking at gender, which is what Simone de Beauvoir was looking at when she said one is not born a woman but becomes one, because she was looking at this whole politics of biology in society. So one of the what do the phenomenologists do? They look at the phenomena in your life which define you, right? The daily phenomena, including your body. To the phenomenologist, even your body is phenomenal, right? So the body is the object that you identify with, which gives you your gender, right? Or you belong to certain structures in society, you belong to certain cultural, institutions in society, and that is how you become who you are. You identify yourself as somebody in relation to these structures. So two important categories that define our identity according to phenomenology are biology, of course, which is your body, and then it is your, and then society, right? So it could be class, it could be caste, it could be race, it could be ethnicity, it could be your age. So suppose I say I belong to a certain age, then you will form a certain idea about my identity, right? Or I say I do not have certain abilities, right? So we have our own idea about age, about disability and ability. We have our own idea of, okay, where we come from. Suppose I say I am a native of this village, right? So the minute I say native, you will immediately box me into a certain identity, or you will form a certain idea of my identity based on my politics of location. Okay, so this is what to a large extent today we recognize as symbolic realism, right? So the fact that all of us are symbolically constructed, right? The fact that if you're a man or a woman, that is a symbol of who you are, right? And it's not real, but that symbol is created in terms of the relationship that you have with the real structures around you. That is the reason why we say symbolic realism, right? But today we recognize that neither biology nor society is adequate for you to understand who you are. So because these are just categories that are given to you, right? So if being a man was one kind of man, or it was a particular category which had very specific features, then I would all the men would be the same, all the women would be the same. It is not so. The fact that all of us interact with these identities in our own specific ways is what makes gender so complex, or any aspect of your identity so complex. Now moving on to the next point, this is what Derrida talked about, right? He talked about iterability. And what did he mean? He meant that you have to reiterate for anything to become a language. So how do we form our identities? If you were to ask Derrida, he would tell you that you form your identities through your interaction with, your symbolic interaction with the world. And what is that symbolic interaction with the world? It's your language, basically, right? So from my childhood, I have been told you are a girl, you have to behave in this way. You're a good girl or a bad girl. What does that mean? It means if you're a good girl, you will do these things, okay? If you're a bad girl, you will not do those things, right? So it is my repeated acts of being which form my identity. And the minute I question them or stop being those identities, or I stop repeating those acts, suppose I cut my hair really short tomorrow, I'm very sure quite a few people are going to find it very shocking, right? Or they might say, oh my God, why did you do this? Why did you cut your long hair, right? Or why did you, do something to your body? Or why did you, or I start speaking a certain kind of language, which is not very feminine? I'm sure society is going to be very shocked, right? So for me to continue to be who I am, to identify myself, right, as somebody, I have to be part of this process of iterability. So where does the term iterability come from? If you remember the verb that we use, we say reiterate. What does it mean to reiterate? To keep saying the same thing again and again and again until it becomes something very natural. And to Derrida, the iterability of language comes from this complex tension between sameness and difference. Okay, so in very simple terms, I call myself a woman because I identify myself with other beings who identify themselves as women. So I see sameness there, right? I see the same body, I see the same, kind of language, or I see the same way of dressing, or I see them following the same fashions. Okay, so I say, okay, I'm a woman like them, right? But at the same time, every time I stand in front of the mirror and I say I'm a woman, I'm saying I am not a man, right? And every time I have to be careful that I do not appear to be a man or behave like a man, to be feminine enough to be called a woman, right? So one of the ways in which philosophers have understood identity is through iterability. It is that part of you which constantly repeats that notion of being which you have internalized or naturalized or normalized, to the extent that you think the most natural thing for you is to be a man or a woman or whatever it is that is aligned with your body. Okay, now let's look at interpolation. Interpolation is an ideology interpolated by ideology is what Althusser says. Louis Althusser, of course, talked about, if you remember, the ideological state apparatus, right? And he looked at how all of us basically are interpolated. And what is interpolation? In very simple terms, interpolation can be understood through one word, which is calling. And what do we mean? So suppose somebody calls you by your name. How will you respond? Immediately you will say yes. So somebody says Sushma on the street, and I'm walking in front, somebody calls me Sushma from behind. I will immediately look behind, right? Because that is a name through, with which I am called. And that is a name with which I identify. Okay. So your identity is a calling, meaning to say tomorrow if somebody says you are a Hindu, I will say yes. If somebody tells me you are a Bangalorean, I will say yes. Somebody says you are upper middle class, I will say yes. Or somebody says, okay, you are somebody's daughter. Aren't you his daughter? I will say yes. Because these are the various names in which I have been called. And all the names with which you have been called are the ways in which society interpolates you, right? Ideologically, right, identifies you with its own structures. It could be caste, it could be religion, it could be your gender, it could be your sex, it could even be your sexuality, right? So if somebody calls me a bad word, right, I mean, I'm definitely going to be very demoralized because that is not somebody whom I identify with, right? So whatever names, right, you identify with, whatever labels you identify with, whatever ways of being that you identify with, these are the ways in which you are interpolated. And that is how your identity is formed. Your identity is formed within that tension between ideology calling out your name and you saying yes or you saying no. And that is the best part. Even when you say no, you say it's not me, right? That is an act of recognition according to Althusser. So he uses two words. Two terms. One is connaissance and the other one is méconnaissance. And what is connaissance? Connaissance it's a French word for recognition. Okay, so I mean, he gives this example. Somebody knocks at the door. What will you do? You will open the door and you will see who it is, or you will peek through the keyhole and you will see who it is. And if it is somebody whom you know, then you say, okay, I'm going to open the door. Or you're opening the door for somebody and it's somebody whom you know who is at the door, you will let that person inside. What will happen if you don't know the person? You will say, I'm sorry, I don't know who you are. You have not come to the right address. Ask the person, whom do you want to see? Whom do you want to meet, right? So whether you let that person in or you send that person away, according to Althusser, every act of recognition or méconnaissance, which he calls misrecognition, is an act of interpolation, which meaning to say all those things that I am not, okay? So I am not tall, okay? I am not slim, I am not a Christian, I do not come from one of the rural areas of India, okay? I'm not lower middle class, I'm upper middle class. So all of these things that I'm saying I am is at the same time an act of not being someone else, okay? Which is what mechanism is. So which means that even if you don't identify as something or someone, even that is an act of recognition. Which means that every time you recognize yourself as a man or a woman, right? At the same time, you're saying, I am not the other sex, or I am not the other gender, okay? So, which leads us to the next idea, which is the idea of, I will come back to performativity a little later, the idea of the abject. So who is the abject? The abject, the term again, abject, resonates with the term reject, if you observe, right? So Foucault talks about this. He talks about how, you know, when a space is formed, right? Say a city or a town is established, what happens? You will keep the madhouse outside, you will keep the prison outside, you will keep the leper colony outside, you will keep all those people who do not belong to society outside, literally on the fringes of society. And this is how you create your citadel, your city, or whatever space that is. So for any subject to be formed, right, there has to be, to begin with, the recognition of the abject. So the abject is the foundation upon which the subject is formed. So who is Sushma? Sushma is all that, right, she is not supposed to be, right? So, I mean, I'm associate professor of Christ University. I work in a department. I come from a certain urban background. I come from a certain educational background. So I'm sure when you saw me, you expected a few things from me. Okay, she's going to talk in a certain way. She's going to be, you know, presenting herself in a certain way, right? So one of the things that I'm not supposed to do, for example, is I'm educated, right? So it would be extremely disagreeable, right, for me to behave in an uneducated manner, right? So I'm forever conscious of the fact there are certain things that I have to remove from my system, that I have to keep out from my system. But those things that I keep out from my system are what define who I am. So the subject is basically founded upon the repudiation, which is the dismissal of the abject, right? Which is the same thing that Althusser is saying. So you might think, why is man talking about so much of theory? So I'm just trying to give you an understanding of the complexity of identity, right? So when I say I'm a woman or I'm a man, right, I am not just my gender. My gender cannot be separated from other aspects of identity, because identity is a seamless process. So when I say, if I just say Sushma is a woman, that's not enough. You will say, what does your dad do? Are you married? How many children do you have, right? Where do you live? Where do you work, right? So, and that, don't you think that is interesting? Because that is how you're going to identify me. And all of these things are going to define my identity for me. So at no point of time can I separate the woman from the Hindu. No, at no point of time can I separate the Hindu from the caste to which I belong in India, right? Whether I like it or not, no matter what university education I get, I'm still, you know, aware of my caste in so many different spaces, including the forms that I fill regularly for the government, right? So it's very important, therefore, for us to understand that when you are looking at a woman, right, you are not looking at a complete integral being who is all woman. At some point of time, the woman whom you are looking at became a woman because she kept the masculine, so-called masculine qualities at bay, or she chose to be a woman in certain ways in relation to the, you know, hegemonies that she belonged to. It could be her family, it could be her religion, it could be her caste. Okay, so the point that we are trying to make here is identities do not always already exist, which means that you don't become a girl. Yeah, you're in the process of becoming a girl, and it's a process that you need to reiterate consistently, and that is what Butler calls performativity. Perform your gender. Where is your gender? Where is my femininity? My femininity is in my performance. If I stop performing as a woman, I will cease to be a woman. Society will not recognize me as a woman. It's as simple as that. It could be the jewelry I wear, it could be the dress I wear, it could be the accessories I wear, it could be the way I talk, it could be the whole projection of my body as feminine, which makes me identify myself as a woman. And that is a performance, right? So, and it is performativity because Again, she borrows from Derrida's iterability, and she says, because you repeat the same performance every day, day in and day out, it becomes a very unconscious performance. It becomes a process of iterability, which is reiterating your gender through certain acts of performance. So according to queer theory, which is where Butler is talking from, right? According to queer theory, whether you're masculine or feminine is part of a performance. You are not born masculine or feminine, or that, there's no one way of being masculine or feminine. It would be a very boring world if it was like that. Okay, so look at these various concepts and frameworks in philosophy that are available to us. Okay, to come to that shift, or to come to that turn, which we call as the identity shift, right? So that is when we start talking about identity politics. And what do we mean by identity politics? It has both negative and, positive meanings. The positive meaning would be identity politics would relate to a group, right, which identifies as a group that has common qualities or common sources of oppression and fights against it. For example, racism, right? So we have all heard of negritude, isn't it? Yeah, negritude is a movement, a horizontal movement of Black consciousness, right? It happened in the Caribbean, it happened with the Afro-Americans, especially through the Harlem Renaissance in the US. It happened all across Africa. And we know in our post-colonial readings, we know that negritude is a movement that brought Black people together. That didn't matter where they came from, didn't matter whether they had a history of slavery or not, but they all came together as one community, which was fighting against racism. That is what we mean by identity politics. That is the positive meaning of identity politics, where your identity becomes a collective political consciousness and a fight against oppression. But today, identity politics also has a very negative connotation. It is seen as excluding other aspects of identity or other people who have similar forms of oppression, right? So for example, the Me Too movement, right? So the Me Too movement is a very recent, I think in the last 2 years, it has gained a lot of momentum, but it has also come under a lot of criticism, right? Because the Me Too movement is about women coming out to talk about, sexual oppression or any kind of sexual, violence, either through language or speech or through, bodily acts that they have faced, right? Including molestation as children, right? So the Me Too movement became a global movement that looked at women's, sexual oppression in various ways, right? And the Me Too movement, right? It's the same thing as what is happening in India with the post-Nirbhaya scenario, where we talk about rape, right? So where, rape is seen as the victim narrative, right? And women are seen as the victims of rape, right? And we do not even talk about other forms of rape, okay? So these are examples of how identity politics can become extremely constricted and restricted to a particular community and can exclude other people. So I have to tell you that identity politics has both, positive and negative connotations. So the point that we are trying to make here is that gender is an identity. And because gender is an identity which is constantly interpolated, which is constantly performing itself, which is constantly based on the repudiation of the abject, which is constantly a space of, relating to phenomena. It could be social phenomena, cultural phenomena, biological phenomena. So whether you look at it through the lens of existentialism or deconstruction or any of the, movements or concepts, right, you will realize that at the point of time that we are in today, right, identity is a word that is used very consistently and frequently in theory and literary studies for the simple reason that identity is fluid. Identity is intersectional. And what do we mean by intersectional? It means that there are different identities that are intersecting or crisscrossing, or there are layers of identity, one on top of the other, one below the other, intersecting the other, that forms an identity. So an identity is not as simple as, okay, I say this is a male identity or a female identity. So having this understanding of identity and identity politics, right, can feminism take the, or hazard, or take the risk of not addressing the multiple layers of identity. Can there be a feminism without identity politics today is the question that I would like to ask. Okay, so in order to illustrate the heterogeneity or the polyvalence or the multiplicity of identities that are part of feminisms today, I'm going to use a lot of examples. Before I do that, maybe I will just come back to the I will just come back to the session. Yeah. Yes, can I have any, do you have any responses? Are you able to follow? Are you able to relate to what I'm saying?
Ma'am, you want us to open the chat box?
No, yeah, chat box probably, sir. Not conversations yet. That I will take later.
Admin, you please open the, enable the chat box.
Sir.
Yes. Okay, thank you so much, because I took a slight, theoretical turn there, and I was hoping that all of you understood these aspects that we were talking about, right? So it's important for us to look at a movement that is happening right now. I will just go back to the slides in a minute, but before that, you look at a movement that happened recently and it is still happening, Black Lives Matter, right? So this was a direct result of violence that was meted upon, an Afro-American citizen, a black citizen in the US, by a white official from the police force, right? And you have seen the kind of outrage that the world has seen after this incident, right? It's very interesting to see how in the history of racism that US has seen, there have been any number of movements, including the civil rights movement that went on for many years, right? And on paper, you know that there is no racism, literally, right? I mean, in the sense that there is no difference based on race or skin color in terms of the facilities that you enjoy, in terms of the education, right? In terms of the resources that are provided to a US citizen, for example, right? But we only just need to look into the surface or scratch the surface to see how these forms of oppression cannot always be addressed in terms of policy, right? Because the idea of racism is based on difference, right? And not just a difference, but it's based on a contradiction in terms of black versus white, right? And that is what makes it so problematic, right? So every now and then you will see that these movements resurface or these debates resurface, okay? So for a long time in India, especially after the Nirbhaya incident, we have been talking about rape, okay? And then we have been talking about molestation of young girls, children, right? Who are literally, say, 1.5 years old or even 3 years old, right? So we are looking at sexual violence, we are looking at all of these different aspects of, difference or oppression, right? And if you notice this very closely, right? I mean, all of these are, lived experiences. We are actually looking at lived experiences, right? And at some point of time, we realize that whatever theory we discussed in class fails, right? For example, when you look at a debate where Nirbhaya's, assaulters were hanged, right? And you look at the debate that was happening there, right? The debate that these were adolescent boys and they should not have been given capital punishment, right? On the other hand, there was a very strong, outcry asking for capital punishment for these offenders, right? So I'm not going to discuss the case here, right? But it's very important and interesting to look at the actual debates that happen around lived experiences. And I think it's important for us to look at these examples, right? So even as we look at literature, even as we look at post-colonial theory or Indian literatures or Dalit movement or subaltern literatures, right? It's important for us to look at this, the intersection of caste and gender, the intersection of race and gender, right? and discuss these lived experiences, right? Because this is what gives us an understanding of the very specific forms of oppression that women face on the one hand, and the institutionalized forms of violence that men are sometimes encouraged to practice. So if you look at the whole rape culture that is happening in India today, it is part of a larger discourse of media, right, which objectifies women. We know that. It is part of a larger, industry of production of sexist images about women. Or even look at your WhatsApp chats, look at all the social media that we share where there is so much of sexism, right? And look at the whole notion of masculinity, which is founded upon the idea that men need to be aggressive, that men need to be violent, that men need to be hard beings, right? So would it be possible for us to look at rape, for instance, without looking at the whole construction of masculinity, right? So do we look at rape merely in terms of crime and punishment, in terms of legal justice? What about social justice? So these are some of the questions that I would like you to ask, right? And a more inclusive feminism will ask these questions, okay? I will leave you with that small question and then go back to, how is it different from gender studies? Okay, so I will come back to the questions a little later, if that's okay with you, right? So let me go back to the presentation. Just a minute. Yes, are you able to see the screen now? I hope so, because it says that the screen is being shared. Okay, so, yes, sir?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Okay, so I want you to look at history of feminisms in India, which have been intersectional, which have been what I call dialogic. Now, dialogic is a term that I'm borrowing from Mikhail Bakhtin again, for the simple reason that he goes beyond the dialectic, which is negotiating the binary, right? Whether it is male, female, upper caste, lower caste, black, white. So these are very dialectical approaches that we take, right? I think, to my mind, or in terms of the research that has gone into feminism all these years, I have found that Indian feminism in India and feminism largely in South Asia, right, is very intersectional and dialogic, right? Because you look at most of the writers who talk about women, they are talking about women from the space of caste, right? From the space of ethnicity, from the space of nationalism and violence, okay? They are talking about women from the larger politics of family, right? And marriage, which is very central to the ways in which men and women transact with each other. And in none of these writers do I see the failure to address men, or the failure to address other, larger forms of structures of oppression, okay? So we are not just looking at a woman who is oppressed and taking a radical stance here, but we are looking at the whole culture or the whole framework or structure of oppression, okay? And to me, I think these are writers whom we can look at, right, to have a more heterogeneous, polyvalent understanding of feminism, okay? So, yes?
So the file is in the, sorry, the screen is in the file mode. Can you change it to PowerPoint's presentation?
Okay, yeah. Yes, this is okay, sir?
Yes, ma'am, it's clear.
Yeah, that is because I'm shifting to the chat box and back to the presentation. I think it is getting minimized. Okay, so one author that I would definitely begin with, and I do this in all my presentations, not because I have a preference for her, but then because she is a very important starting point to look at the nature of feminisms that we have had in India, and that is Mahashweta Devi. Right? Now, Mahashweta Devi is not a writer who identifies herself as feminist at any point of time. She does not call herself feminist. She does not use the term feminist, even in Bengali, in which she writes. But it's interesting to see how, her approach to feminism is very, very dialogic, right? So I want you to particularly look at one story called Breast Giver, which is taken from her Breast Stories, okay? I hope many of you have read Breast Stories. If you haven't, please read it. It's a very powerful piece of work. and not just, I mean, again, I would not classify it as feminist. It is, of course, subaltern studies. Spivak has translated it. And a lot of the translation that Spivak did for Mahashweta Devi, in fact, made her revise her whole position from which she began, which you remember is, can the subaltern speak? If you look at the theory that comes from Spivak after her translation of the breast stories, you see, her standpoints are considerably revised, right? And there is a very beautiful introduction by the translator, right, by Spivak here, which is as good as the stories themselves, right? And it can be a very good starting point for subaltern studies, especially feminist subaltern studies. She gives a beautiful introduction about the challenges of translating this writer from Bengali to English, right? Bengali having been her own language, but the challenges of translating a feminist text, right? So Breast Giver is the story of Jashoda, right? And Jashoda is an upper caste woman, right? She is married to Kangali Charan, okay? And of course although they are upper class, they are extremely poor. Kangali Charan, as the name says, he is Kangal, right? So he's, he works in the sweet shop, right? And every now and then he steals some, samosa or some sweets back home for his children. And there is Jashoda, right? So one day what happens is the Zamindar's youngest son has a new, motorbike, right? A Studebaker, which he, runs on the feet of Kangali Charan. And that is very interesting. See the choice of name that Mahashweta Devi has exercised here. He's called Kangali Charan, right? And in this act of the reckless driving of the Zamindar's son, Kangali Charan actually loses his feet. Charan mean feet, right? So he loses his feet, and he's the only earning member in the family, and the house is full of small children, right? So Jashoda becomes the wet nurse, right? So the idea here is that you are looking at an upper class Zamindar family, the richest family in the village, right? Which employs an upper caste woman, right? Look at the whole politics of how and why Jashoda is employed. Jashoda is employed because she is an upper caste woman. Otherwise, she would not have been allowed to suckle the young children of the Haldar family, which is the Zamindar family, right? So she becomes a professional wet nurse. So the women, the daughters-in-law in the family have multiple children, right? But they do not breastfeed the babies. It is Jashoda who feeds them, right? So Jashoda literally becomes the cash cow of the family. She is the one who feeds her family, and she is the one who milks herself for the family of the Haldars, right? And it's very interesting to look at the choice of names. Now, Jashoda, if you remember, is of course, it's a variation, it's a North Indian variation for Yashoda in South India. Now, Yashoda is not the real mother of Krishna. Yashoda is the foster mother of Krishna. And Yashoda is the one who brings up Krishna. And if you see Krishna as a child, you will always see him with Yashoda. You will not see him with his biological mother, who is Devaki, right? So how does the story end? The story ends with Jashoda old enough not to breastfeed children anymore. Please remember, in order to breastfeed the Haldar children, she has to continuously go on giving birth to young ones. She has to keep having children, okay? So, she cannot stop having children, because then she cannot breastfeed, okay? So here is a body which is by itself, right, as a mother breastfeeding her children, right, in a Marxist sense. It does not have any exchange value. It has only use value, right? But the minute she starts breastfeeding the children of the Haldar family, which is the family of the village, right, she becomes the Devi, right? She becomes literally, a goddess, okay? And Kangali Charan is given the post of a priest in the Kali temple there, right? But what happens to Jashoda herself? After she has suckled all these children, including her own children, after she has breastfed them for so many years, right, she develops breast cancer, right? And at the end of the story, you have a body, right, whose breasts are festering with wounds, whose body is cancerous, and who is abandoned in the hospital ward with nobody to attend to or to provide for. So the universal mother of the village, Jashoda, becomes an abandoned body, which is cancerous. Okay, so the same breasts cease to have any exchange value. After they cease to have exchange value, society has no use for the body of Jashoda, right? So this is a very radical text, right, which questions the notions of caste or gender, of the whole politics of the feminine body, right, and the politics of production and reproduction, right? So when a woman breastfeeds, right, when she reproduces for the family, the body does not have any exchange value. The body gets an exchange value when, right, she becomes a wet nurse, right? But the minute the the cash cow literally stops producing the milk, right, what happens to the body, right? So you look at, different institutions interpolating her body, right? Jashoda literally becomes, the mother at various levels. And at the end of the day, right, what we have is an orphan body. So this is a very important graphic narrative, which looks at the whole politics of, caste through the feminine body. And what happens to an upper caste woman who is supposedly privileged in terms of caste when she belongs to the lower class, right? And what happens to the women in the Haldar family who are not allowed to breastfeed their children? Because why do they have to, why do they have to do this? Why are they not allowed to breastfeed their children? They are not allowed to do it because the men are all educated and they have new modern ways of thinking, and they want their women to maintain their bodies, right, and not to lose shape, right? So you have this whole discourse of the tradition of caste and the demands of modernity upon the Haldar women, right? And Jashoda, right, shows you both ends of the spectrum here, right? So this is a very intersectional text which looks at the whole politics of gender through the subaltern perspective. Not necessarily from the lower caste or tribal perspective, which she does in a lot of other stories. In the same collection, she has the story Dept, which is about, which is of course, right, based on Draupadi from the Mahabharata, right? And that has the flavor of the Naxalbari movement and what happens to tribal women, right, during the Naxalbari movement in India, okay? So, this is a very important text, right, which you cannot read through a Western lens, okay? Although Spivak has done it. She has done it through a Marxist feminist perspective, which is what I outlined here, right? But to understand Mahashweta Devi, to look at Mahashweta Devi's feminism, you will have to go beyond the rubrics of feminism that are available to you. And that itself is a very interesting starting point, right? So I want you to look at, Ramabai Ranade, for the simple reason that this is a generation of women that we don't even look at in feminism. I don't think we prescribe them in our courses. We don't look at the challenges that women faced during the colonial period or just after independence, okay? Unless we talk about Sarojini Naidu or Toru Dutt or one of these women writers who gained a Western education or who went to Oxford or Cambridge and came back and wrote like Keats or Wordsworth, we don't really look at women during the colonial period. So two people whom you can definitely look at is, one is Tarabai Shinde and the other one is Ramabai Ranade. I have taken Ramabai Ranade's example again because she was an upper caste Hindu woman married to the great reformer Ranade, right? And as a young girl, right, who's hardly about, say, 11 or 12 or maybe 13 years old, married at a very young age into this family without any education, because she is married to a reformer, there is the burden on her to become educated. There is the burden on her to become a reformer's wife, right? So when we look at reforms and especially social reformers, right, during the independence period, especially Raja Ram Mohan Roy, or when we look at Sati or widow remarriage or any of these reform movements, we tend to glorify them, we tend to exoticize them, right? It's important for us to recognize that it is the women who took the burden of modernity, right? And she becomes Pandita Ramabai much later, of course, right? And a lot of these women also become widows and then they convert to Christianity, right? So the whole point that I'm trying to make here is that these women had to become educated and they had to uphold reform movements, right? As a form of women's nationalism, So you look at the nationalist movement in India, it was largely a men's movement. And how were women co-opted into it? They were co-opted through education. So this was the time when women, were asked to join a lot of schools, but then of course their education would be discontinued after primary school. And then when they, were married off, they were expected to be proper wives. They were expected to cook well. They were expected to follow the wishes of the women in the family. At the same time, they would be married to reformers or husbands who were into the reform movement or the freedom movement, right? And they had to straddle this, they had to juggle these roles of modernity and, so-called tradition, which required them to be women. For example, Tarabai Shinde talks about, in her autobiography, she talks about how she goes to the temple, okay? So there is a Harikatha going on, she goes to the temple. And she wants to sit with the women, right? And where are the women seated? They're all seated on the floor, on the carpet, right? And some of the men are seated on the chairs, including her husband, Ranade. Now, Ranade, her husband, insists that she should come and sit on the chair, right? Now, she's torn between the women who require her to conform to their group, because after all, she is a woman, right? And she has been raised to behave like a woman in the family in which she grew up. And later, she is married to a man who asks her to sit on the chair. He says, why do you want to, you're my wife. I want you to sit on the chair. And there are these women who, feel, oh my God, what does she think about herself? And all the women are sitting on the floor. Why does she want to sit on the chair, right? So do you see the whole politics of how women are the ones who are required to, make these changes? Not very different from what women are required to do today. For example, right, you are a multitasker. You say women are born multitaskers. Women are born managers. They can manage everything. And you have seen all these advertisements run, which is a recreation of the modern Durga. So you have the ladle or the spoon in one hand, and you have the laptop in another hand. You have a baby in another hand, and then you have, some files in another hand. So, women, they have to, who has made them very efficient managers, right? It's a system who requires us to be efficient in everything. So women can manage the family and work. Oh my God, they are brilliant, right? But you talk to the women, right? How do they manage, right? And do they really want to be efficient managers? And does a woman who does not want to work outside, does a woman who wants to work at home, right, have the freedom to be at home, right, and be treated well, right? And does a woman who work outside have the freedom to give up her domestic duties completely, right? It's not that. It's not just about who does the housework. It's about how at the end of the day, you are symbolically, right, addressed, understood, how you are recognized as a woman, right? So although the systems outside have changed, although there is education and jobs and a lot of money and, success for women out there, and you see women who work outside as very successful women, right? But for the woman herself, it is a very difficult balance, and that's what we are trying to say. So some of these women who, according to Eunice D'Souza, belong to the lost generation, the lost tradition, she says. She says that somewhere feminism in India has to address this death, because these were the first women who wrote. And if you observe very closely, this is a Marathi work that I have put up for you to look at. So her story is written in Marathi, her autobiography is in Marathi. Like that in Andhra Pradesh, in West Bengal, in Tamil Nadu, in Karnataka, we have so many women writers who have written their stories of being women in the colonial period, in their own languages. But how many of us even look at this as feminism? Right? We do not even look at this as feminism, because for us, where does feminism begin? It begins after independence. It begins with all the women who were part of the freedom movement, or it begins with all these women, right, who started going out and education, right? So, my own family, right, when I look back at my grandmother, her life was not very different from that of Tarabai Shinde, right? So she got a primary education because that was the time when women went to school. But when she was in her 7th standard, she had to leave school and get married to her own uncle, maternal uncle, who was my grandfather, right? And my grandfather was a professor in English. So, she had to learn English. She had to read the newspaper. And she had to be a professor's wife, right? But I always remember her wearing her traditional sari, right? With the pallu tucked in here, running around with spoons and ladles and managing a family of 7 people. Right? I don't think there were many times when she went out of the house, right? Uh, but she would watch her television, she would read her newspaper, and in her own way, I think she managed her life very beautifully. And to me, she is a feminist. But do we look at these women? Do we look at the lost tradition? Do we look at our grandmothers? Do we look at them as feminists? So these are certain, approaches that feminism needs to take. Okay. Now let me look at a more recent writer who takes the same kind of intersectional approach. And this is again a writer who will repeatedly come up in my presentations because I cannot ignore her. She is very contemporary, right? And she has revisited the Ramayana through a very different genre. You have many women writers in India who are writing novels, basically, based on the Mahabharata. These are all feminist revisionings. But you have very few people who have used the short story to revisit the Ramayana, and that is what Olga does. Now, Olga writes in Telugu, right? And she has a most, I would say, phenomenal work is called The Liberation of Sita. And this is a collection of short stories where in each story, Sita is in a dialogue with a minor character from the Ramayana, right? And this is very interesting because what happened to Sita is the same thing that happened to Shurpanakha, right? Both of them were exiled. Both of them were dismissed, right? And there is a story in the collection where Sita and Shurpanakha meet, right? And they share their experiences in relation to the men in their lives, right? So Shurpanakha's nose is cut off, you know that. But you also know that, probably do not know that her breasts were also cut off. So every part of her body which was feminine was disfigured, right? Because she was, that she was not Aryan, right? She was a Dravidian, okay? So if you take the, that is what Olga does. She takes the whole, war in Lanka from, a feminist perspective, and she looks at this as the Aryan-Dravidian conflict, basically, right? So why would you, for example, why would you look at the people living in Sri Lanka as Rakshasas or as Asuras, okay? Which is precisely, I'm sorry, what your Amish does now when you look at the Immortals of Meluha and all these stories. You look at look at Shiva and his construction of Shiva. Shiva is a very Aryan figure. I'm sorry to bring this up, but this is something that we have to notice, right? Why is it that our mythological figures are so Aryan, right? We have so many different Ramayanas down here in the south, including Kambam's Ramayana, right? Where Sita is not exactly the wife of Rama, right? So going back to the Liberation of Sita, this is a text where Ahalya speaks out. Ahalya is the one who is waiting for Rama to touch her with her feet. She has been turned into stone to be liberated, right? And there is Manthara. Manthara is the hunchback, and we blame her for, the conspiracy theory, for, venomously infecting Kaikeyi's mind. And Kaikeyi goes to Dasharatha and says, I want to ask for those 3 wishes which you granted. You remember when I saved your life, right? And so these women are seen as plotting. So Manthara is a hunchback, she is disfigured. So in Manthara, you have the story of a woman who is disabled, right? And how do we look at disabled women? How do we look at women who are not aesthetically beautiful, like Sita, for example? Why is Shurpanakha such a put-off? If Shurpanakha was not a Rakshasi, or she did not belong to the Asura clan, do you think she would have been able to seduce Rama or Lakshmana? These are the questions that we need to ask. And what happens to Shurpanakha after her breasts and her nose are cut off? Right? You will probably see her in the popular versions going to Ravana and crying her heart out. And Ravana says, oh my God, you did this to my sister. I'm going to, take you on Rama, and I'm going to kidnap Sita. Right? But you actually look at Olga's The Liberation of Sita. She is looking at the whole question of why women have always been blamed for the number of wars that have been waged, right from the Greek times, right? So you have, I don't have to tell you the story of Helen of Troy. I don't have to tell you the story of Draupadi, right? And look at the number of wars that have been fought for women, right? So the question is, were these wars fought for women? Or was there a larger political ideology for which you used these women as pawns, right? Or you made them the, culprits for your own, politics of what? So these are some of the questions that, Olga is asking, right? So you have women from different castes. You have women who are disabled. You have women who are, part of the Aryan-Dravidian divide at that point of time. And you have Sita herself. right? Who is the queen, right, of Rama? Now, nobody less than Rama, who has gone to Vanvas, who has spent so many years in the forest. But hey, what happens to her? How many Agni Parikshas, right? How many times does she have to be sent to the forest to prove herself pure? So this notion of purity, which is what happens to Ahalya, right? So, you know, the story of Ahalya, she does not know that it is Indra who has come in the form of her husband and who is sleeping with her, right? So can you hold a woman responsible for not, you know, I mean, for recognizing her own husband in another man's body? I mean, not knowing it's another man's body, that it's Indra, right? So, I mean, it's very interesting to see how she questions these very, very accepted normative notions of purity, chastity, virginity, of caste, right? Of the whole politics of, you know, Ramayana being the epic, of Rama being the Maryada Purushottam, right? So this is a very interesting example, right? The next example is from a Greek author. Okay, I'm not restricting myself only to Indian feminists. I would like you to look at Olga Brahms. Now, Olga Brahms is a Greek lesbian poet, and it's very interesting. She revisits all the popular myths of ancient Greece, okay? And she also revisits some of the fairy tales. So I have not chosen a myth here, I have chosen a fairy tale here. And the fairy tale that I have chosen is that of Little Red Riding Hood. Now, Little Red Riding Hood, if you remember, is a small girl who wears this red hood, right? And she carries a basket full of goodies from her mother's house to her grandmother's house. But here, you know, in this poem, I don't have the time to discuss the whole poem, obviously, but this is a poem where Little Red Riding Hood does not go back to the grandmother's house, right? So she opens the basket, okay? She goes into the woods, okay? And she does all those things that a girl is not supposed to do. So that journey from the mother's house to the grandmother's house is very symbolic of the journeys that daughters have to take, right? That they have to be careful, that they have to walk on the right path. Make sure that you do all the things that your grandmother did, right? She married, she had children, right? She was a very good woman, right? And you belong to this family of women. Make sure that you go back with your basket of goodies. And you know what the symbolic meaning is here of the basket of goodies. Go back to your grandmother's house safe and sound, because there are wolves on the way, right? And do not smell any flowers on the way. Remember all the instructions that the mother gives? She says, don't open the basket, don't smell the flowers, make sure that you go knock on Granny's door and hand over the basket safely to her, right? But in this poem, Little Red Riding Hood gets lost, right? She gets lost on the way, and she opens her basket with other women, with other girls who are also going back to their grandmother's house. So it's a lesbian text. So, but the most important thing that I want you to notice is not that aspect, but I want you to look at this nostalgia for, you know, the tradition of women which is lost, right? See, the idea that because she is a lesbian, she cannot have her own children, she cannot be a biological mother, right? And she wishes that she had a daughter who would come out of her, right, the way she came out of her mother's womb. Okay, she wishes for a tradition of women, right, which is not like the one that Red Riding Hood took, but would still connect her with her mothers and her grandmothers. So basically, this is a poem of longing for the mother. That's why she says, "I grow old without you, mother, landscape of my heart," she says, right? So it's not so much the actual person, the mother, but the fact that the mother is somebody whom she cannot be. She cannot be a biological mother. She might adopt a child, right? So there is a very different lesbian text here. This is not just a lesbian text which looks at two women who are attracted to each other. It's a lesbian text which looks at the whole relationship among women, right? As one long tradition whose history has been lost, because women continue the tradition of families, of societies, of religions that they marry into or that they belong to, or whose structures they are part of, right? So that is Little Red Riding Hood for you. Let me go on to interesting writer Imtiaz Darkar, who is partly Pakistani, who is partly Indian. Of course, she is now a Scottish evangelist. She is married to a Christian and she lives in the UK. right? And she has two very interesting poems. One is Parda 1 and the other one is Parda 2. And both of them look at the concept of the Parda, right? I will not be looking at Parda 1 because that is very, very, interestingly, it's very directly the Parda that Muslim women wear. But I want you to look at this Parda, which is Parda 2, where she talks about the Parda of the mind. So in Parda 2, which is a slightly longer poem, she is looking at women, Muslim women from Islamic origin living in other parts of the world, right? Especially in the UK, which she is now part of, right? So she looks at women not wearing the veil, the traditional veil, right? Women are freely allowed to go out because now they are part of a Western society and they have to become part of that society. There is an assimilation that has to happen for them to be citizens of whichever country they have emigrated to, they have migrated to. So they are maybe second or third or even fourth generation immigrants who have never been to their country. But you see, they have to constantly negotiate the fact that they are from a Muslim family and they belong to a Western culture, right? So she says, to bind their brightness tightly round, whatever they might wear, in the Parda of the mind. So it does not matter what you wear, because where do you wear the Parda? You wear the Parda in your mind, right? They veiled their eyes with heavy lids. So they may not have worn the Parda, they might not have worn the hijab or the burqa or the niqab. They may not have bodily wrapped themselves up like women in their own countries, but even as they are going around, right, with the freedom to wear what they like, with the freedom to be, students, workers, citizens of another country, right? With all that freedom, they still wear the Parda of the mind, right? And their eyes are veiled with heavy lids. So this is a very interesting post-colonial take on what we call as trans-historical feminism. So what trans-historical feminism does, thanks to globalization, is to look at, okay, all women's experiences are universal. It does not matter what their historical basis is, right? But there is a trans-historicity, right? So you see similar forms of oppression, right? Say between the East and the West, and you do a trans-historical reading. But then this is a very essentialist understanding of feminism, right? Because you believe that once a woman goes to the West, once the woman gets a Western education, or she becomes a US or UK citizen, right, that she has all the freedom in the world, right? But she is still a Muslim girl or a Muslim woman living in a foreign land, right? So it's a very beautiful poem. Please go back to it and look at the whole, discourse there of transnationalism, transhistoricism, religion, gender, right? And the whole modernity that comes with immigration, right? So how do we look at women around the world? When we look at them through a transhistorical lens, we fail to understand the specific forms of oppression that they face, right? So you could be transhistorical, but you could still be rooted in tradition, okay? Yeah. So I will very quickly, I think it's, I think, so I think I have overshot the time a little.
Yes, ma'am. Another 5 minutes. Can you take another 5 minutes?
Sure. I have just 2 or 3 more examples. I will wind up.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So I want you to look at a few works that look at gender through the perspective of masculinities. Now, this is very important because although the theoretical framework for masculinities is a few decades old, most of our gender studies syllabus or women's studies syllabus does not look at men at all. Although we have a lot of theory, we don't necessarily look at men, okay? So there are 2 novels that I would like to recommend. And interestingly, they both come from gay literature or queer literature, as we call it. That's the broader umbrella term, right? So this is one way in which you can question hegemonic masculinities. So what is hegemonic masculinity? Any approved way of being male or man or boy or whatever it is. So there is a certain dominant way in which, or hegemonic way in which you're required to behave like a man, right? So there was a time I remember when I was much younger, when I was a student, when the most preferred groom or the most eligible bachelor would be from the IT sector. Or he was a software engineer and he was going to the US, oh my God, he would be the most preferred boy for your girl, right? Now you see most of the engineers are doing MBAs now, right? Because you want them to be a management executive, right? Or you want them to be geek, you want them to be techno savvy, right? So we require men to behave in certain ways that makes them acceptable as men. So, you know, the whole discourse of masculinity is largely discussed in sociology and anthropology, in fact. So feminism has been discussed extensively in women's studies and literature departments. Fortunately or unfortunately, masculinities, who are the people who are doing research in masculinities? These are people who belong to sociology departments, right? So if you have people in the sociology department, friends in the sociology department, they will be more than willing to talk about men, interestingly. So what I'm saying is, look at these two authors as examples, right, of a very inclusive kind of feminism where you are looking at masculinities. Okay, so Cobalt Blue is again a Marathi novel which has been translated by Jerry Pinto into English, and this is a love triangle, and this is very different from a love triangle, the love triangle that all of us are familiar with, right? So here you have a boy who comes as a tenant to stay with the family, and there is a brother and a sister, and both the brother and the sister fall in love with this boy. Okay, and that is the tension. So because there is the tension of heterosexuality, and there is also the tension of this boy getting attracted to the same boy that his sister has fallen in love with. Okay, so this is just an example, because this is a novel which questions the hegemonic understanding of masculinity. Okay, and this is something that I really want you to look at, which is Queer Diaspora. Shyam Silvadurai is a Sri Lankan writer. In fact, during the riots in Sri Lanka, you had this conflict, the ethnic conflict between the Sinhalese and the Tamils. His ancestral house was burned down and his parents were forced to emigrate to Canada, right? So he's a Sri Lankan Canadian writer, and he's a gay writer, right? And this story is about a young boy called RG, right, who likes to dress up like a girl, who behaves in very feminine ways, which is not acceptable through society, and to whom his home or the notion of home itself becomes unhomely. Now, unhomely is a term that I'm taking from Homi Bhabha, right? Which means that you can be at home, but you may not be accepted at home. So you might feel very unhomely. So homelessness is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about unhomeliness, which means that for a boy who is coming out as gay in traditional Sri Lanka, in an Orthodox family, his own body may not be very homely for him. His body itself might become very unhomely. So for anybody who undergoes either sex change or gender differentiation in terms of a non-binary understanding of gender, right? Or a sexuality that is not in alignment with heteronormative, the body can become a very unfriendly place. Okay, so this novel looks at both the unhomeliness of the body and the unhomeliness of Sri Lanka, and how this boy emigrates with his parents, right, to Canada, which is a much more accepting space. Okay, so I put this quotation here because Robert Frost says home is the place where when you have to go there, they have to take you in, right? And it's very interesting, right? Because home can be a place where you may not be accepted, where you might feel very unhomely. Okay, right. So let me look at the last author, like one of my favorite authors from Tamil Nadu, Kalki Subramanyam. And Kalki Subramanyam, as you know, is she represents the Hijra community at the UN. She's a model, she's an actor, you know, and she's an activist, right? And this is a poem where she talks about the transformation of, you know, herself, right? So how she became a Hijra and how she had to remove the phallus, right, to become the woman that she wanted to be, right? The reason why I have put her here is because I want you to look at trans women, right? So when we look at women and feminism, please remember that women are not just women who belong to the gender binary of male and female, right? In the gender spectrum. So today we look at the gender spectrum, and in the gender spectrum, you have many different kinds of women, right? These could be transgender who have not undergone any sex change. These could be transsexual who have undergone sex change. These could be transvestites who dress up like women and perform their bodies like women. It's important for us to address these femininities too, right? Within the discourse of feminism. Thank you. So I will end with this particular slide. I found this very interesting because this is, I mean, a very good example for intersectionality and a dialogic consciousness in feminism. You see, it is a quilt which is stitched together by various women, right, from different parts of the world, from different races, from different backgrounds, ethnicities, right, and they are, it's a pastiche of different experiences. Okay, so let's look at heterogeneity, let's look at specificity, let's look at intersectionality, and look at the dialogic, right, as important in our understanding of feminism, because it's important to have this dialogue between feminism and masculinities, between feminism and queer, between queer and race, between race and disability, gender and disability, right? So whenever we prepare our curriculum in class, or whenever we take gender to class, let us not just follow the model of, women's empowerment or women's equality, or look at the whole Western model of feminism, because we have any number of writers who have addressed feminism from a very dialogic perspective. And that was the whole point of introducing you to these, what I would say, right, new feminisms, which are required mostly in our curriculum, in our research, in the academic space that is so much dominated by Western ideology and philosophy. Okay, so I would like to thank Ramsubaya sir especially for inviting me, for having me over, Dhanalakshmi ma'am for introducing me and for setting the right tone for what I was about to discuss. Parimala ma'am, who is now the HOD of the department. I don't know if she's in the meeting. A few of my friends from the department, especially Dr. Rati, Vimala, they have all become my friends from Manars College, right? And there is a community, of friends that I have. And then, it was a pleasure to, be part of something that was organized by Manars College, which is very close to my heart. And I cannot thank Mr. Sudhakar enough, because yesterday there was some problem with my internet settings. So he had to, he sat up till 12 o'clock in the morning, 10 to 12, 2 hours. We tried to resolve it. It didn't happen. This morning he came back at 9 o'clock and he resolved the problem for me. I think I have to say that, the commitment that this team has towards the webinar is it's immense. I think any institution who has people like this will definitely go a long way. And I'm very sure Manars College is going to be someplace very nice and someplace else in the global, scenario sometime soon, because you have a very committed team working for these projects. Thank you so much. I did want to show the last slide, if you don't mind. I didn't stop sharing, but I don't know why that happened. Just a minute. This is for the participants. Yes. So this was my thank you slide, and this is for all of you. Sorry. Yeah. So I thought this column from our South Indian tradition is a very good representation of what we have been discussing. A dialogue, an intersection of identities, right? And the fact that we are working on feminism together, that it is an inclusive feminism which includes people of different genders, of different orientations, of different social and cultural backgrounds. Thank you so much. You can now address your questions and you can give me your feedback. I will be very happy to respond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It's a very great presentation. And I would like to directly go into the questions.
Yes, yes.
There are a number of questions there. I have selected few for you as the time is short.
Yes, I'm sorry I overshot the limit.
No, it's okay, ma'am.
Yeah.
Now the first question is from Professor Rajeshwar Pushpam.
Yes.
Her question is, would you share your opinion about feminist, womanist, and humanist? What do you prefer to be?
Okay. Okay. See, when I'm reading Maya Angelou, or when I'm reading some of the Afro-American feminist writers, or I'm reading The Color Purple. So these are some of the womanist works that I have read. To me, womanism comes across as, it's very close to my own experience of feminism. Because if you remember, if you look at In Search of My Mother's Gardens, it's a beautiful piece of actually feminist theory, but it is a very evocative, emotive work, right? Where there is a collective consciousness of women, which is very different from the feminism that we know of in terms of movements and activism and theory. So to me, womanism is something that I would relate to more closely as a person. But I mean, I would say womanism resulted from the what would you say, the hierarchies that white feminists practiced, especially in the first wave movement. You know that black women, right, were kept out of the feminist movement. For example, I mean, even white lesbian women, I'm told, were asked to be at the back of the parade, right? And all the heterosexual women would be in the front of the parade. So that was how exclusionary the first wave feminists were, actually. It might look as something very emancipatory to us, but it had politics. And I think womanism was a response to that radical, white, mainstream, racist feminist politics. So womanism is something that resonates with women's lived experiences. But I would definitely, I mean, looking at the larger framework of feminism as a gender studies teacher or researcher, I would say that womanism has made immense contributions to our understanding of feminism. I mean, I don't know whether I can politically claim myself to be a womanist, but I would prefer the term feminist perhaps, because to me, feminism also includes these movements, womanism. And I think the other one was humanist, right? I'll give you a very small example. It might appear to be like a contradiction to you, okay? But it's very interesting. I mean, I was talking about the spectrum. So feminism has a very wide spectrum today. For example, I have a friend, a very close friend. She's very fond of pets and animals. She's an animal lover. And she is a huge supporter of veganism, right? To the extent that she talks about the amount of violence that is meted out upon cows on a regular basis so that they can produce milk for us. I also have friends who are feminists, who are fighting against the beef ban and the Hindutva propaganda, right? And who are talking about the whole politics of communalism of religion in India, okay? So both of these are feminists, right? So it's not about whether, you know, she's right or she's wrong, or whether vegans are right or have they gone out of their minds. See, personally, I'm a vegetarian. I drink milk, right? So I mean, I mean, I drink milk. I need my milk. I need my butter, right? I have friends who are vegan and feminist. I have friends who are supporting, you know, I mean, who are very much, you know, against a lot of ideologies which are being perpetuated in India, right? So I would not look at them as opposition, right? I would look at all of them as very human, because you asked me about humanism, right? So where does the human begin, and where do the boundaries of the human end? I mean, it's not easy to answer this question, in the sense that what is human to me might be very inhuman to someone else, right? But I would definitely say that you know, feminism has to be humanist in its outlook, and not just in terms of inclusion, but also in terms of tolerance. I was just thinking, what would happen if these two friends come together? One is supporting veganism, and the other one supports, right? I mean, does not support the you know, ideology of combining politics with religion, right? And she's somebody, you know, who talks regularly about beef ban, right? And she's against it, because she says what you eat on your plate is your personal business. Like Vivekananda said, right? Somebody asked him, see, you're a saint and you eat fish, how come? He said that's none of your business. My kitchen has nothing to do with my, you know, spiritual life, is what he said. That was his response, right? So these are two ends of the spectrum, right? So as many human beings as you will have those many intersections, you will have those many feminisms, right? So it's important for us to, I think it's important to look at inclusive, whether you're looking at humanism or feminism or humanism.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Shaista Irshad. She has asked the question, if feminism is about equality for both men and women, then why gender studies? She wants to know the difference between gender studies and...
Okay. I think I saw that question. It's a very interesting question, and I'm not surprised because we like to think that, number one, we like to think that women and men have to be equal. Let me just move away from that debate of equality or that notion of equality, because that's what I was trying to do in the entire session, if you notice. Okay. So if you ask me what is equality, what does it mean for you to be equal to a man? Is that your notion of equality? Definitely not, right? So see, the point that I'm trying to make here is the reason why feminism has moved into a larger discourse of gender studies is because you cannot talk about women without talking about men, which we have not done for a long time. Let's admit it. We have not talked about men for a really long time, right? Or if we have talked about men, we have talked about them in relation to patriarchy or in relation to certain cultural hegemonies, right? How many times when we take, do we take a feminist text to class in terms of the characters who are male? Or do we look at all of them as oppressors? Or do we look at all of them as, the villains of the piece? I will give you a very simple example. I think I gave this example in a webinar last week, which was organized by Christ. I didn't want to repeat the example, but then since you have raised this question, I was talking about the discourse of rape, isn't it? So one of my scholars, MA dissertation scholars, she worked on a particular novel. It's called The South of Forgiveness. It is a novel where a woman, who has children, is adult enough to forget her past or to overcome her past, she goes back in search of the man who raped her when she was a young girl, to have a dialogue, to talk to him about what happened, to understand why he did what he did to her, right? This is a dialogic text, and I mean, it's a very interesting text. We are not even ready to talk about men when it comes to rape. I'm sorry to say this. Number two, we don't even talk about men being raped, do we? Men also get raped. In fact, there was a feminist who came from a very leading organization to one of my workshops, which I had organized for my students. And one of the students, boys, he got up and said, "Ma'am, what do you think about male rape?" She said, "Men cannot be raped." That was her response, right? Because we don't even have a discourse for men when it comes to certain, narratives. We forget about the discourse. We don't have those narratives. So wouldn't it be interesting to look at why the Nirbhaya incident happened from the perspective of the criminals within quotes? To me, it is important. To me, that dialogue is important. I'm not talking about psychological counseling. I'm not talking about giving them redemption or pardon. What they did was unforgivable. But do we even narrativize the experience of the men who raped, right? What drove them to such violence? What drove them to such aggressiveness? What drove them to do the kind of things that they did to her? Is the system taking any responsibility for the male aggression and violence that it is perpetuating through media, through pornography, through there is so much of child pornography on the internet. I'm sorry if I'm talking about a controversial topic, but I have to, because there is no way in which I can answer something without looking at the different dimensions. There is so much of child pornography available on the internet, right? And where does that come from? It comes from a certain understanding of masculinity. It comes from a certain construction of masculinity. It comes from a certain expectation of violence or aggression from men, that men have to be wild, that men have to be forceful, that men have to, get what they want no matter what. It's the same thing with their careers. Look at the amount of pressure a boy undergoes in terms of his career, right? Because he is not just getting a career for himself. He's not just getting a job for himself. He has to manage a family. He's going to be the head of the family. He's going to take care of his own family and start a family. He has to take care of that family. And you belong to larger institutions, right? You have to uphold your lineage. You have to uphold your religion. You have to uphold your community. Men have to, I'm sorry to say, men have so much more, right, to do towards the institutions that they belong to. But we don't look at that gendering process at all. We just look at them as perpetrators of, crimes, and there is a certain politics of gendering that happens with men which we don't look at. And what about the so-called third gender? You dismiss them as third gender, right? We don't even look at the gender spectrum. So that is the reason why I'm saying talk about feminism, right? But talk about feminism within the larger rubric of gender. Bring in the other genders, bring in the other narratives. Unless we do that, feminism will continue to be a bad word, right? I'm sorry. I mean, feminism, it's almost a slur. It's almost a derogatory term today. I don't think any woman wants to be called a feminist, even if she is, right? Yeah, thank you. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. As we are running short of time, I would like to conclude with the last question.
Sure.
See, as we are talking about new feminism, do you think, ma'am, women herself is responsible for her situation, as she is the one who continues the traditional rules and customs to another women? That is from mother-in-law to daughter-in-law, etc.
Okay. So, see, it's the same question that I asked you about patriarchy. So, just in the same way that you create an equation. You say men is equal to patriarchy, right? That's the same thing that we are doing with women here. Women are also part of a larger system, right? So, for example, when my mother wants me to do something which is not very agreeable to me, for example, I might find it very, because she wants me to do it because I'm a woman, I might say, right? I may not forget about mother-in-law. Sometimes I have those differences with my own mother, right? But I understand that this is happening because my mom is part of a system. She is part of a tradition. She was part of a family. A family which she was born into, a family she got married into. So I would look at the ideologies that are operating through various institutions, right? And I wouldn't blame the women, right? So women are also products of a larger ideology, right? Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. I have one more important question to be asked.
Yes.
From Professor Kannan.
Okay.
From Karnataka. And the question is, hasn't Indian feminism emerged from Dr. Ambedkar's struggle for gender equality and the Hindu Code Bill? Without
Definitely.
Indian women to struggle, because Indian women never struggled for right to vote or right to education, something. So then why, how can anybody who talks about feminism in India ignore Dr. Ambedkar's contribution to gender equality?
Sure, sir. I mean, if that's addressed to me, it is not because I did not ignore him, in the sense that I would completely agree with you, because I took a literary lens. I was talking about feminism and identity politics in literature. That's the only reason why I did not touch upon Ambedkar. But definitely, if you look at the feminist movement in India, Ambedkar has a huge contribution, especially in terms of policy change, in terms of political consciousness. And I think what he did for caste, he also did for women. I will have to acknowledge that. I'm sorry if it was an omission on my part, but then I was not, it's impossible to look at look at everything, right? So I was just looking at intersectionality and dialogic consciousness. And I was doing that through a few women writers and men as well. Okay. And I also touched briefly upon the queer. You see that in fact, I have not done justice to the queer at all. That will require a different session altogether. I have just looked at two authors here. Yeah. So, thank you so much. Yeah.
So we have received a lot of comments and positive comments. It's everybody, they were overwhelmed with their presentation. And as time constraint, we have to close the session. And we thank you on behalf of Manar Thirumalnaikar College and the department.
Thank you,
I
ma'am.
would like to thank you for your great presentation and the answers.
Thank you so much for having me over. It's always a pleasure. I hope to interact with you more often. Yeah. So my best wishes to the department and to the management of the college. I think I saw a few management, representatives from the management.
Secretary sir is there.
Secretary
Yes,
sir.
yes. So I would like to thank him for creating this platform for an easy and free discussion. And I hope that whatever I have discussed will be understood within the objective framework of gender studies. Yeah, and I hope I have been able to extend a few, barriers and, boundaries.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your lengthy and exhaustive and enlightening session. And still we could see 350 participants now. And I think that they are not able to leave from here. Thank you so much for this insightful and enthralling session. And I would like to introduce to you the yesterday's speaker. She is also available.
Yes, sir. Yes.
And she wants to attend the session, and she is right. She is right.
I think it's Dr. Yasmin. I can see her here.
Yeah, Yasmin is available. Madam.
Yes. Hello, Dr. Yasmin. Nice to meet you. Hello.
Yasmin.
Pleasure meeting you. Pleasure meeting you, Doc. Yeah. I was really looking forward to your presentation, and what a wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much.
I must say that it's one of the best gender studies presentation that I have attended. Beautiful presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to have missed yours yesterday. Sorry,
your balanced look at everything, and how you have tried to look at all the aspects, queer literature, feministic literature. It's beautiful. I have enjoyed every bit of it. Every bit of it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'll get in touch with you. I will get in touch with you. Can have more conversations. Thank you.
Please. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Marcelin, shall we close it? Yes. Thank you, Yasmin, ma'am. Thank you so much. Participants, thank you so much for being with us. Let us meet tomorrow morning by 10:50, 11 o'clock. We'll start the session. Thank you so much. Bye to you. Have a good day. Thank you so much.